Hey everyone, Brendan Sutter here. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me and welcome to Best and Worst Albums from Alice Cooper. So a lot of artists have really big catalogs and it can make it very hard to try to pin down what is actually their best album, especially if they have a stellar catalog where they've had a lot of really great albums over the years. To try to pick that best album can be very difficult. And likewise, it can be really hard to relegate one of those albums as the worst if you think all of them are really good. Of course, to the opposite side of that, sometimes there is a real stinker amongst the catalog and it jumps out at you. But regardless, we're going to be focusing on Alice Cooper for this episode here. He has 29 studio albums, 7 with the Alice Cooper Band, and 22 solo albums. So all of that together, I'm going to go through and present to you guys the best and worst of Alice Cooper. Before we get into that though, if you're new to my channel and haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things do help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And of course, there's an added bonus by turning on notifications. You'll never miss an episode and you'll stay up to date with really cool episodes just like this with the best and worst of Alice Cooper. All right, so we're going to actually start with the best this time. Last time we started with the worst, thought we'd mix it up here and go in with something good first. So first up, one of the albums I was considering as his best, but I'm just going to talk about some of the best ones right now, and then I'll give you guys the actual one that I'm choosing. But first up, Killer from 1971, fourth studio album as the Alice Cooper Band, right? The first 7 of them are Alice Cooper Band. It's produced by Bob Ezrin, who's worked with Alice on a lot of different albums, certainly starting out early on with this one right here. But this is the album where I feel like the sound really came together for the band. It's ultimately what they sort of were able to finalize and realize as what it was the sort of glory of the band, that sound that Alice has continued on ever since. And I feel like it starts here on this album. There's a lot of killer standout tracks on this one here. Under My Wheels, Be My Lover, Halo of Flies is awesome on it. But for me, the album cuts on here are just as good, sometimes even better. My favorite track on the album is Dead Babies. And that one, whenever he plays that live, for me, it is just over the top. It's really cool. Great song. Doesn't get enough love on its own, but it should be a really standout track for him. And as a kind of a cool side note, this album also had Rick Derringer do additional guitar on 2 of the songs on here. The song Under My Wheels and then also the song Yeah, Yeah, Yeah. So just kind of a cool thing. I think all those things coming together. This album itself, in the end of the day, went platinum, just showing you how great of an album it is. But it's held up throughout the years. I think it's one of his best. Another one is this one here, which we move into Alice's solo career. Welcome to My Nightmare from 75, so debut solo album. As I said, now talking about the solo Alice Cooper, produced by Bob Ezrin, so he's continuing on, and it's a concept album. This one here has the songs playing in the sequence of a nightmare that a child, Stephen, experiences. So that's where this is going here. But I think part of the testament to why this album is so good is that the backing band for this came from Lou Reed's backing band. If you know anything about Lou Reed, you know he uses really good musicians. So the quality of those musicians come over, play on this thing here. And this is an album where Alice was able to really show his true colors on, get into that theatrical rock approach more so than just the sort of glam rock sounds that the band itself had been exploring up until this point. It's got some of his best songs on here. The title track, Welcome to My Nightmare, Department of Youth, Cold Ethel is on this. But again, we got some really cool deep cuts or album cuts on here. Devil's Food and The Black Widow. Again, 2 songs that are very eerie, right in the wheelhouse of what I think that makes Alice Cooper great, like that song Dead Babies from Killer. So this here, just another classic album, start to finish, sounding really good, letting it, become that powerful element of what it is that we like so much about Alice Cooper. For me, coming through on this album, I think in spades. Okay, moving on to Trash in 1989. It's his 11th studio album, 20th, or I should say 20 years on from the Alice Cooper Band's debut in 69. So whether that tied into it or not, but I'm sure Alice was sort of taking stock of things. And for me, this became a very high watermark album. And it was certainly successful, at least in those regards as well, putting Alice Cooper back on top, resurrecting his career. I mean, he was already starting to have an upward trajectory with the two previous albums where he was going more in a metal direction than what he had been doing and then the sort of pop 80s sounding stuff that he was doing. But now he's moving in a glam metal direction. And Alice, of course, changing his stripes all the time. It's one of the things that he does. It's both to his, being a positive thing, but also sometimes to the detriment, which we're going to talk about a bit more when we get to worst albums. This one here, produced and co-written by Desmond Child. I think he took this album to the next level with the co-writes and the song structuring and arranging that he did. Poison was his first top 10 single since the song You and Me in 1977. So as I said, really puts him back on top. He's got a lot of cool guests joining on this one. Members from Aerosmith, Bon Jovi, Winger, Toto, Steve Lukather, the guitar player, was on here. Just a big bombastic album from start to finish. It's got a cool mix of sleaze and melodic hard rock of the day. And of course, you've got Alice sneering across the whole thing the way that he does. And I just think doing it in fine form. Not a bad track on this album. We talked about Poison. House of Fires on here, which is really good. Bed of Nails, which is a co-write with Desmond Child on it, and Diane Warren, two of the best songwriters out there from the 80s. Hell is Living Without You, which is a John Bon Jovi, Richie Sambora co-write. So just all kinds of different things like that coming together, making this album just one of my absolute favorites. And if we had to go with just favorite album, not talking about best or anything else, this is probably my favorite Alice Cooper album. Now, one of his more modern day albums where I think Alice came back in spades, Paranormal from 2017, 20th solo album, 27th overall studio album. Cool thing is this one here has bonus disc in it, and we've got 3 tracks on here that feature the original Alice Cooper band. So I'm sure that's part of why I like this so much. But we've got Michael Bruce on guitar, Dennis Dunaway on bass, Neil Smith on drums. Unfortunately, Glenn Buxton died in 97, of course, couldn't be part of it, but you've got that old school flavor happening, even if we're just talking about those tracks, but I think that influenced it overall, and or is why he did songs with the original band on here, because they would fit in so nicely amongst everything that had been written. But this was an album, a return to form album in sound, and after the 2 previous albums that I thought were huge missteps, this one here I thought did it up right. We've got other cool guests, Roger Glover of Deep Purple, Billy Gibbons from ZZ Top, Larry Mullen Jr. from U2 is also on here, and killer standout tracks like the song Paranormal, Dead Flies, Paranoid Personality, and Dynamite Road. Just, again, all really good standout tracks. So if for some reason you dropped off at some point, weren't listening to later day era stuff, I highly recommend this album. It really sits in the top 5 of all Alice Cooper albums, in my opinion. But what is Alice Cooper's best album? I gotta go with Billion Dollar Babies from 73. This again is with the group, 6th studio album from the band, went to #1 in the US and the UK, became the band's biggest selling album at the time, certified for being platinum. And in my opinion, part of the reason I'm choosing, I think it's the most consistent sounding, at least of all the early Alice Cooper stuff, the band, but it is one of his most consistent sounding records, song quality wise and musical style wise throughout the album. 4 hit singles on this one from the Billboard Hot 100. No More Mr. Nice Guy, number 25. Elected went to number 26, which I always found fascinating because that was a re-recording of the song Reflected from the late 60s album Pretties for You. But of course, having done this in election year probably helped it tie in more than anything, which is what brought it all the way up to song number 26, Hello Hooray, which was a number 35 hit. And then the song Billion Dollar Baby is probably the best song on the album, only inched up to 57, but still, 3 top 40 hits on the album, I think says a lot for the album. But again, a lot of cool deep cuts on here that have gone on to be concert staples like Generation Landslide, and then I Love the Dead, another great song, a fan favorite. They still play it live, making this album here, I think, the quintessential Alice Cooper album. All right, so we're going to shift gears now and talk about what are worst albums from Alice Cooper. And generally speaking, I don't think he's actually made any that are outright bad, outright stinkers, but some of them, because he changes his style so often, he tries to move with the trends sometimes, they don't always work very well. And so one of those albums is Along Came a Spider. 2008, 18th solo album, 25th studio album, produced by Bob Ezrin. He's worked on so many albums, and in most cases, he makes the album stellar. But this one here, I think, was a huge misstep. It's a concept album, and it chronicles a serial killer named Spider, who ultimately is later revealed to be Steven from Welcome to My Nightmare. So a tie back to that, meaning the album should have taken on a bigger personality than it did in the end, but it really didn't. And there was actually supposed to be a sequel to this here, but ultimately Bob Ezrin wasn't really feeling it. And so they skipped doing that and did Welcome to My Nightmare 2 instead. But I think that kind of also tells you the quality of this. If this had done well, or everyone had really enjoyed it immensely, we probably would have gotten a part 2, but I think it is a misstep of an album. There's some really strange sounds on it, some musical effects that are on this thing. One of the songs, Wake the Dead, just has a weird, strange guitar sound. And the album itself, very dark overall, which certainly should work well with Alice Cooper and everything, but it comes off sounding as though he's trying a bit too hard to be modern. And the album comes off just as an oddity in the end of the day. It doesn't really connect with me very much and just overall lacks cohesion. As a concept album, I don't think it works, but just as a standalone album, it also doesn't work very well. And so, I mentioned the album that ultimately the part 2 of this became Welcome to My Nightmare, the sequel to the original, coming out in 2011, I also think is a huge misstep and one of the worst albums that he has made. 19th solo album, 26th overall, produced again by Bob Ezrin. And this is where I was starting to feel like Bob Ezrin might not be the right guy for the job, although he comes back with this album here and proves to us that in the end, he's able to do it. And who knows what was the reason behind those missteps. But Welcome to My Nightmare 2, the 2011 album, as I said, is a follow-up to the original. It's a new nightmare from Steven, the main character, but it really has little resemblance to the original. The original one I know is of the era in 75, but this one here is trying to take on modern pop sensibilities and Alice trying to be relevant, in my opinion, and it's just sounds like a desperate attempt. There's nothing about this that's in the wheelhouse of Alice Cooper style material. The track I Am Made of You sounds like it's a boy band type thing with vocal effects and weirdities on it and rockabilly sounds of Runaway Train, but it just lacks cohesion throughout this thing. It's more like a collection of songs than what a concept album really should be. And so they just seem out of place, like there's nothing tying them together, both as an album or throughout in terms of the concept itself. I feel like they forced the concept of it being Welcome to My Nightmare 2 as opposed to it actually having any relation to that. Okay, but The album that I think is Alice Cooper's worst album, if I have to put a pin in it and select one, I'm going with Brutal Planet from 2000, 14th solo album and 21st studio album overall. It's produced by Bob Marlette. And there's some cool guitar players on the album itself. We got Ryan Roxy coming from Electric Angels and Slash's Snake Pit. If you don't know Electric Angels, a cool glam metal band, really, really great album that they made back in the day. Phil X is on here, who would go on to join Bon Jovi, fantastic guitar player in and of his own right. But the style of this album is darker and has a much heavier approach than any album that he did before it, and really any album that came after it, although Along Came a Spider comes close with some of the songs that are on here, but this album sounds that heaviness and darkness and dirginess all the way through. So if you don't like one of the songs on this, it's going to be hard for you to get through this thing. It's got industrial sounds and then those heavier metal sounds. Very reminiscent of what was going on at the time. So I kind of understand why it was being made, but I think it came along just a little too late as well for it to end up having any relevance whatsoever. So not really trend setting the way Alice had done in the 70s, but sort of riding the coattails. And that always kind of bothered me a bit. It bothers me when any artist does it, as opposed to it being a genuine thing that they do. And so unfortunately today, I find that it sounds very dated. It sounds like the late 90s when that stuff was going on. And so while I didn't like it then, I like it even less now because it's just not of a style that I liked back then, but it really sounds out of place. It doesn't sound like it fits anywhere within the catalog. It doesn't fit when he's playing the songs live in concert. It comes across as a strange oddity being played. And again, this is just my opinion. I know there's a lot of you out there that love Brutal Planet, but it's just one of those ones that's sort of an outlier to me and doesn't sound like anything else. And I don't go for it very often, no matter how many times I've tried to listen to this. And I think part of the reason is, it just never settled in for me as an album within the catalog. And because this is the only album that he made in that style, there isn't anything else to relate it to. So again, it's just that oddity for me at least. And that's why I'm selecting it at least as the worst of the 29 albums that Alice Cooper has made through either the band name or solo-wise. I'm not counting the Hollywood Vampires as part of this in here. But there you go. That is the best and worst albums of Alice Cooper. I'm sure you guys have your own favorites and selections for worst ones. Maybe some of the albums I picked as the best are your worst and vice versa. Let me know and we'll have a great conversation about it. All right, everyone, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to you real soon.